very much.
Yeah.
The feeling is mutual. It's good. It was a bit sad to leave, and it's good to be back. And also, it's a bit sad that I can't be with you with drinks at Zephyros. But also, it's very good to be here in Suriname and finally see and experience, the object of my research. So I'll share my screen. I hope everything will work because my internet is a bit shaky here. And of course, there's construction going on next door. So, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the opportunity to present some ongoing work. Like you said, it's really still in the nuts and bolts phase. So I think it's a good opportunity to have some feedback and some suggestions. First, I'll give you some wider context of the project at large that I'm working at together with colleagues at the Radboud University and with partners here in Suriname, National Archives here, and Anton de Kom University. We are building this ambitious database of the historical population of Suriname from the 1830s until 1950. And with the goal, with a sort two goals. One is to make it easier for people to research their family history, which is a lot harder in Suriname than in the Netherlands because a lot of sources are not available online, and also to facilitate historical research, to follow the courses of lives in a colonial tropical society over several generations. So the method is to link these various population databases. I hope you can read it, the slide. So we've already, before I came into the project, there was the slave registers that have already been digitized. And now we are working on which will be the backbone of this integrated database, the civic records, which are the birth, marriage, and death records of the free population of Suriname, which is after 1863, of course, everybody. And before that, it's only a small proportion of the society. Other records, such as migration records of contract laborers who came in the second half of the 19th century to Suriname. So the idea, and two censuses, so the idea is to link all this together. So in September last year, we started with a crowdsourcing project, digitizing these birth, death, and marriage certificates. So I'm heartily inviting you to take a look and even participate if you like it. We have a great group of citizen scientists in the Netherlands, Suriname, and elsewhere who are helping us creating the data. So this is the wider context, and I am working on a smaller side project that is related to this on a small, much smaller population register, which is called the wijkregister of 1846. So this is it's a record of all the people that lived in Paramaribo at this year. There are older registers as well, but this is the one that was already available in a tabular format. And hopefully other earlier editions will become available too. So then we can really look at developments through time. So what's in this source? I have an example here of a year earlier, because the edition that I'm working on is not yet available as scans. It will be soon, but the setup is the same. So it's a rich source. It contains the address of free inhabitants, their names, starting with the name of the house, head of the household. Skin color is registered, so it's either white, colored, or black. Colored meaning of mixed descent, and black meaning of African descent, and white of European descent. And age, occupation, religion, and the number of enslaved people that were living at this address, at this plot, and also of those enslaved people, only their whether they are colored or black, whether they are men or male or female, and whether they are adult or child. So in this case, this example, you see Christina Somermans. She was a free black woman, 68 years old, working as a midwife, a Roman Catholic, living at the Kerkhof or Malabatrumstraat 191 in District B. And on her property, there was one black male enslaved person housed. It might well be someone we don't know if he was her property. We only know that he lived there. It might well be, but we don't know that for sure. It might be someone who she was in the process of manumitting. So this was a process that would take years, could take years. But we don't know. But we can look in the slave registers, and we can find her name, Christina Somermans, and indeed she owned one enslaved person named Frans, whom she had bought in 1835 and who died in 1847. So this is just to give you an idea of what kind of information is in there. There's also important information that is not in there, of course. Obviously, enslaved people are not named. Only their numbers are noted. So we also don't know whether the free people are born free or whether they were manumitted during life, and family relations are also not mentioned, which is of course important. Another thing that is lacking is information on gender. So we can assume this is a woman from her name, but it's not a data point. So I hope to add this information by linking the first names to the HSN, which is the Dutch historical sample of the Netherlands, which is a database with a lot of Dutch first names and the associated sex. And if we can add this variable, we can also use this source to learn more about gendered spaces in mid-19th century Paramaribo, obviously. There are more problems with this source. It's hard to be absolutely sure how accurate and it was kept, especially in the number of enslaved people. I don't know exactly how it was established. What was the difference between colored or black? What's the difference between a child or an adult for enslaved people? I don't know where the exact divide was. But if we take these caveats into account, I think it's a very rich source which will provide us with more information on the social makeup of a colonial city in a tropical society. This source has been used in a qualitative sense for family history research. Also, the recent book by Carbon Fata Black on Paramaribo, he also uses this in a more qualitative way, but I think it has a lot of potential as a quantitative source, and that's why I how do you say, asked for some money at Claria Plus to work with this source and convert it to linked data in order to enrich the source by linking it to other data sources. I already mentioned the first example here mentioned on the slide. I can enrich the source by adding gender as a variable, It's also possible to link it to the HISCO classification to get a more sense of social stratification, and because we have occupations in the source. And another thing that that's very interesting is to try to link it to the slave registers, but which is a difficult thing, because the slave register is a register of ownership. It's about people owning people, and this. So we are not absolutely sure if the people that were living at a certain address were also owned by this head of the household, for instance. But we already did a little sample, and to a certain extent, we can link these registers, and that is enriching on both sides, because in the slave register we don't know where people in slavery lived, and in the wijkregister we don't know names or other personal information about people in slavery. So so I want to focus today on this GIS that I am developing, because I think it can be a powerful method to link information and also to visualize it. Yeah, I'm trying to create social maps of Paramaribo in the mid-19th century. It has been a little bit of a personal side project, but I think it can be really valuable as an infrastructure also for the project at large that we're developing. For instance, think about birth certificates that we already have transcribed now. We can plot all the births in the city on the map. But like I said in the beginning, I'm still in the process of building it, so results are really preliminary, and I just wanted to show you how I did it, and given a sort of a taste of what you can do with it. Obviously, I looked at the Amsterdam Time Machine for inspiration here, and I took from that the idea of with the Friese Academy, the idea of using location points, and they are fairly precise, not at least on the block level. I will show you. So they're not exact, and I'm not sure if we can really get to a certain point where it's really exact. But for the purposes of showing some wider patterns, I think it's really accurate enough. Yes, so the sources that I used to make this map, I just want to give you a brief idea of how I did that. One important one is a schematic map from 1885. That's this one. You see it on the left, the original. On the right, if you try to geo-reference this map, it's a schematic map, so you'll have to really maltreat it to get it more or less on the geographical map. But I did that because I will show you. But so this is a very useful map because it shows all the numbers of the streets, so the street addresses. So Paramaribo was divided into districts A, B, C, D, E, F, and then the first and the second outer district. So each district has its own starts at 1, has its own numbering. And this was made by a civil servant in 1885. And you might think, well, that's a few decades later than 1846. But when I'm walking through Paramaribo now, I'm really struck by how little has changed in the overall street plan. It's and certainly between 46 and 85, very little changes have been made, and I could check that with the second source, concordance, which was made by Mr. Muntjewerf, which is a list of various addresses and how they could change through time, and I could easily track that only very small changes occurred. What I did not do is include, maybe I'm getting too technical, but when the plot was divided into A and B, for instance, I only I left that out of account for this at this point. Then there is a present-day map at the cadastre, sort of the land office here in Suriname, and it's quite useful still. So this is the polygon map of all the parcels. So I can't say for sure if the parcels are. I mean, I wouldn't count on the parcels still being the same, but the numbers still correspond very well. And then there are some
right, Thunnis? You checked all the numbering live in Paramaribo, I guess. No.
Still working on. But it is my plan to on Monday I have some time to take the map on my phone and look up some places. Yes. So, and then there's the historical maps. This is a very good map from 1916, which is, well, you see the railway track on the bottom. So of course there have been some changes, but it's as a geographical map, it's quite good. And then there's this map from 1843. I said it was 54, but it's 53, which is of course a better background since it's a lot closer to the historical period. So I combined all these layers, and I'll just show you a bit how I did this. Can you see the QGIS screen now? Or is there a delay? Are you still there? Yeah, okay. So this is the district. These are districts. So this is Paramaribo now. Obviously, the city has grown. And this is the 1916 map. And so what I did is, so these are the maps that I show you, the schematic maps, and these are the present-day parcels, and these are the location points. So it looks a bit messy, but you see that it's, so these are the present-day parcels, and these are the 1885 numbers, and you can see that it's in many cases just the same. And some cases there was a conflict, and I noted, I wrote all these down, of course. So you see what I mean with that. It's at least accurate on the block level. So I could with fair certainty say that these numbers are between these side streets. So this would allow us to give us some ideas of what Paramaribo looked like, I think, in this period. Just a second. I'm really just finished with this part. So I can just give you a little taste of what you can do with it, but I'm not really happy yet with the maps that I made. So this is to give you an idea of the free people living in Paramaribo. They're visualized by their skin color, which shows that there is some, I wouldn't call it segregation, of course, but there is some clear concentration here of European inhabitants. This is the oldest and most expensive and prestigious part of the city, and you can see here on the edges of the city there are more free black people, and this is also you can probably explain this because these are the most recent developments of the city, and people who were recently manumitted would get land there in this area. So like I said, I'm still working. I'm trying to get better visualizations like heat maps, but I'm just still struggling with the technical issues of doing that. So this is another thing that I was working on. So I was interested in looking at the relation between the color of or the ethnicity of free people and enslaved people living on the same address. And if you I thought this was an interesting example. If you have free people of color, of mixed descent, the darker the green, the more people of color are living at this address, and the larger the circle, the more black enslaved people are living there. So, and if you have the same map of free colored people and colored enslaved people, you see that the number of enslaved people is much lower. And this is also a general effect because there were more black enslaved people than colored. But if you compare it with the others, you do see some effects. So, like I said, I'm not really happy yet with these maps, but just to give you an idea of the things that I want to do with this, and especially if I can also add the gender variable, I think I can produce some interesting stuff, which I hope to be able to show you some next time. Just to end, the data will all be open, and so once it's in a state that I can present it to the world, I will certainly make it available. And yes, I think I'll leave it with this. I'm really looking forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thunnis. Questions, either here in the room or online? Maybe to start, I have a question about your experience with the transformation of your data to linked data. Can you elaborate a bit? So I assume you made use of the cow tool, or?
Yes, I left it out a little bit for now, but yes, I used cow, and yeah, it was as you know, I was involved in converting the cinema context database to linked data together with Menno, Den Engelse, and Leon. And as a sort of a bystander, it seemed quite easy. And when you try to do it yourself, it's a lot harder. But I'm a little bit proud that I did manage to get it to a certain level. I still have to finish it, but yeah. So I used the cow tool, and I will provide a little report on how I did it and the problems that I encountered. So I don't know what else to say. I don't know if you have specific questions about this. I still need to. The next step is, of course, to link the linked data of the wijkregister to, for instance, HSN using Sparkle queries, which will be the next interesting phase to figure out.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting to share this a brief reflection on how it is for, say, someone who's not computationally trained.
Yes, yeah.
Such a Claria tool, which is a command line tool, I think.
Yes. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So it was, that was also one of the goals of this project, to figure out how to what extent it's doable for someone with my background, which is not, I'm not a programmer, and it is doable, but it takes some time and some help also. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Nice, but wonderful, admirable that you did it, because I think later you will have a lot of pleasure from this.
Absolutely.
From the Time Machine side, we're also very happy that this will be available in as linked over data.
Yes, we would have to think if there's any possibilities to see the links, of course, between Amsterdam and Paramaribo. That would be really interesting.
I see very nice follow-up research projects emerge here. Yes, Victor.
Thanks a lot for this. I was wondering about this link to HISCO. So you're linking of the registers to HISCO. You mentioned that, but I was wondering, did you already do this, and how successful was it? And can you tell maybe a bit about the type of occupations that are more prevalent and how they are distributed among the types of people that you're looking at?
Thank you. Yes. No, I haven't done it yet, and I'm not even sure if I can manage to do it on a short term. But we did have a look at it more on a qualitative sense, and it is also very interesting, not only for direct research purposes to see which occupations are more prevalent, etc., but also from the perspective of how compatible is a classification that stems from the Western European reality. To what extent can we use it for this tropical colonial society? And we had an interesting example that we presented earlier at the DH Benelux about. That's the sluiswachter, which is a profession in the Netherlands. I'm not even sure what the English term is. Lock keeper, I think. So someone who would operate the waterways and be part of the management of the waterways. But in Suriname, it's a completely different type of occupation. It's more, especially for people in slavery, which is obviously a completely different way of looking at occupations. This was so plantations. They had these locks that were important for instance, also for managing water, but also for providing water power, for pressing the sugar canes. So when someone in slavery was old or disabled, they would be sort of put next to this lock as a sluiswachter, which was more like a euphemism for retirement, or I don't know how to put it, but it wasn't really a very active job. It was just sitting there. And so this is an example of how these the names of these jobs are not always very compatible. So that's something that I'm still really interested in exploring, but I can't give you any results yet on it. Sorry.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions?
I think Charles has a question.
Charles?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a question about the racial classifications you make use of. Do you think that it's possible to get more background from, let's say, the administrative background of who decided about these racial classifications? And especially because, well, you focus now on 1 year, but the idea is, I think, to make it over the whole period of time, and these classifications change in time. So how are you going to deal with these issues? When you look, for instance, to the censuses, yeah, then you will see a very detailed classification, which is very, yeah, in our view, very racist, even in 1950, the latest one. So how are you going to deal with these issues?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a difficult question. I haven't found any sort of legal instructions on how it was dealt with at the time, because these wijkregisters, they were compiled by wijkmeesters. So each district had its own wijkmeester, and he would compile the information. It was obligatory, so if you wouldn't provide the information as an inhabitant, as a head of household, he would be fined. So in that sense, but I don't even know whether the wijkmeester or the one who reported would report the ethnicity. That's a problem related only to this source. But I think you have a good point on how to deal with it over a longer period of time. Because if I'm not mistaken, the census of 1921 does not contain any ethnic or racial classification. So they, and in 1951 does. So there's a real large gap there. And so I don't have an answer yet to that question, but it's very, it's a very good question. And I think for thinking about the 1950 census, I'll just have to see it when I get there, how to deal with it. But thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. If there are no pressing questions, thank you very much again, Thunnis. And well, I hope you have a good stay there and productive stay where I go. So from Suriname, we go to the collections of colonial objects that ended up here. To the project on the tracing the digital traces of colonial objects in museums that Sarah Choily works on as a PhD researcher at the User-Centric Data Science Group of the Computer Science Department at the University, Universiteit Amsterdam. And she works together and speaks today together with Victor de Boer, who's assistant professor at the same group, and who is a specialist in, well, connecting data, linking data, among others, the fields of cultural heritage. So we're very excited to hear what you will tell us about graph mining on historical paths to digitally trace colonial objects in museums. The floor is yours.
I just learned that we are apparently no longer needed because people can now convert and link data themselves. Sort of like
you made yourself and your expertise superfluous. Yeah, that's.
And also me being here together, I hope you don't see this as a sign of mistrust, but just of me being very excited to be back here again.
Yes, we're very happy to have you here.
Always nice talk here. It was a while ago. Great.
A little bit slow.
Yes, there we go.
Perfect.
So thanks for inviting us. And yeah, sort of do a talk. What I'll do is just to basically an introduction into the broader research challenge that we are looking at and the project Pressing Matter, in which we're doing this. And then I'll quickly hand over to Sarah, who will take you through the actual details how it all actually works. Oh, are you sharing the wrong screen? Wrong screen? I'm not an Apple person, but computers. Okay. Now I will let you your whole screen.
Yeah.
Yes. Now I think. Yes. Great. All right. So because I wasn't sure how much background you have in Postdoctoral, which is now obviously way more than I expected. People I know that are familiar faces, but still, I think in the digital humanities domain, with more and more data being shared among different projects and made reusable, we see these knowledge graphs pop up. And of course, digital humanities is an application domain. It's not the only one. We see that in many different fields. And at our research group at the VU, but also in other places, we investigate how these things should be built, the type of formalisms that we use for that, but also how we apply them in specific domains. For me, as a digital humanities researcher, it's always interesting to figure out what are the actual needs of humanities researchers, and in what way do the current data models fit this. And if the answer is they don't fit yet, then we should change the models, right? Not change, try to force you into our amazing data structures. And one of the things that we're looking at now is this idea of polyvocality. I'm really glad I put the reference here because this is something that we're not just looking at VU, but is something that's of broader interest, and I'm happy that it made the title of today's Create Salon. Fantine is also going to talk about this idea of polyvocality, which is, I think, for typical data scientists is hard, right? It's hard enough to put data in a table and to agree on all the fields and the metadata that we're going to use. Then suddenly we get into the humanities domain, and now things are slightly more difficult because we have multiple views of data, and we have context, and we have criticism on data, and we want to include all of that in these data models that we're using, because we want to ask not the easy questions, but the hard questions. Right? So the easy questions are for yesterday's researchers. We now want to answer the hard questions, such as the one that Thunnis just presented, but other ones as well. Right? And what we're also seeing is that when building these data sets, there's now a lot of interest in this idea of biased artificial intelligence, right? If we're deriving new facts or visualizing things, and we know that there's bias baked into the data models that we're using for that, then we're basically rehashing old mistakes. So we need to be aware of that, and we also need to have technical solutions that are able to deal with that. At a more generic level, what we're looking at is how can we use these knowledge graphs that we think are quite suitable already for having these multiple representations about the same things. But still, we need to figure out how to make them work for these specific, difficult polyvocal cases. And I see that the slides here make all of them number one, so they're equally important. We need to understand, have methods that are able to identify polyvocal models, right? So how do we deal with these crowdsourcing methods, or natural language processing methods, or methods that convert data from one source to another? But these methods need to preserve and identify these multiple views and multiple contexts, and not just throw them away for each use. Then we need to have methods that are actually models, data structures, and they can be in these knowledge graphs or linked data, but maybe that's, let's say for now, well, our working hypothesis is that this will be a generic model for this, but we still need to figure out how do we represent these different contexts, that things are true in different time periods, for example. I think the sluiswachter example was a good one, and I remembered why I asked the question, because I think I saw the edge presentation. I remembered it, but this is, I think, a good example of something that means something different in a different context. And that doesn't mean that we now suddenly have to just, make a decision whether we choose A sluiswachter or B sluiswachter, but we need to represent both and in some way also put in the same knowledge graphs that these are valid in different time periods or in different geographical regions or for different people. Right, so that's representation, and then the last one is we need to also show that to people. Is having very nice ways of actually visualizing this polyvocal. So these are sort of the broad research questions that we're investigating in many different projects in different contexts, but the ones that keep on coming back. I think maybe one thing also why I put this on here is because this is not just, I think, a digital humanities questions, but this is more of a semantic web, data representation, data science, computer science question, right? So that's, I'm standing here in front of you as a computer science, because these, I think, fundamental questions, and again, we need to make sure that the things that we're building as engineers, as scientists, are suitable for the type of difficult problems that we have. I just wanted to show you this because it's not just something that came up recently, but we're doing this already for a few years, and considering these multiple views. One of the solutions that we made in an earlier project called BiographyNet is a project on biographical data from the Havens Institute, where we have, for one person, we might have multiple biographies, and these multiple biographies might have contradicting information, or they might emphasize different things. So we need to have models that sort of retain this polyvocality, but still are usable and point to the same person. So I can still ask, when was this person born, and get a sort of decent answer. But now, if I'm more curious, I can also ask, according to whom, and how did we get this answer? And that might go even so far that we have all of the natural language processing that extracts some of this more fine-grained data. That all of that is available to the very critical user. So there's sort of different levels of data provenance there. So there are some solutions for that, and it looks like linked data as a model allows for this sort of complexity and these multiple views. So we're now in the Pressing Matter project. Both me and Sarah are participating there, in which we're looking at the colonial heritage. So the Pressing Matter project sort of exists in this larger societal and humanities debate around colonial heritage, specifically about restitution of colonial objects in various Dutch museums. So we're collaborating with a number of museums, knowledge institutions, including the Vrije Universiteit, but also others, but also societal groups like the Black Archives here, but also groups in so-called source communities in countries in, for example, Africa or Indonesia. Right, and the project, this is sort of the right is a bit the boring part, but what we investigate is from various angles this idea of what should we do with these things and how should we even talk and think about them, and what are the potentialities or what is possible with these objects. And one problem is, of course, that nobody has a very clear image of where all these objects are, which objects are problematic, and in which way they are problematic. So there's a lot of different work packages and people thinking about it. And what we are looking at is specifically digital traces. So in what way can we use the existing databases, repositories from the museums to investigate where did these objects come from? Are there potentially problematic objects? And maybe even how should we redefine some of these databases? So this is also part of this idea of decolonizing the database. So we're open to the suggestion that the data that we have in might not be a good representation, or there might be new models needed for adequately representing the data in these data stores. Specifically, again, they're equally important. We're looking at several modes of acquisition. Right? So in these, often if you look at the provenance information from objects, it might say that the object is found. So that's an official provenance. But looking more closely, and what provenance researchers do, it might be that it's found, but it's found in the context of a violent conflict and after a violent conflict. It's literally found on the ground while the people that owned it before might have been killed in a violent conflict just moments before. Right, so even the word "found" here is let's say a view or perspective on the provenance of the data that might be open for reconsideration. So we're specifically looking at redefining these modes of acquisition. We're looking at objects and collections where objects came to Dutch collections through scientific expeditions, through involuntary disposition, through trade. That might be also a trade within a power, an unequal power relation. So still, this is not something that is, say, an easy case, and also voluntary disposition. So there's a lot of missionary activities also.
Do you have access to the complete databases, or like as an outsider from what's on the website?
Both. So that's a very good question, and I think also one of the challenges that we are facing. But we have access to the provenance information, which is typically not shown to the public outside. Still, we want to do as much as possible with public data, but here we're really sort of trying to work also within the constraints that these often privacy, security, or trade secret type hidden information has for us. So specifically, the data that Sarah is going to talk about, I think, is most of the provenance data is not public information. Within the project, we're looking at how much we can make public. Right? So I think we're still trying to see how much we can open up. Yeah, that's it for me. So I'll sneak away behind the curtain.
Wow, it's theater.
Nice.
So thanks to Victor for setting up the stage for me. So yes, as Victor already mentioned, that thinking about polyvocality is difficult for a computer scientist or data scientist. So I am very much trained to be a computer scientist or data scientist. So for the last 6 months, I have been dipping my feet into this interdisciplinary project and trying to learn from it. So here I am to ask suggestions and remarks of the ongoing work that I am going to talk about now. So as Victor already mentioned, the aim of the present matter, which is to use museological approaches to help society to come to terms of legacies of colonial past and resolve conflict from different stakeholders. By identifying the manner of acquisition of such object. So in the context of pressing matter project, we have around 500,000 objects only from the National Museum of World Cultures, where I am specifically looking at. So the problem with this data is there is a little to no information. So on the right-hand side, you can see there is an interface from the museum system. So what you can see on this, so on different fields, there is a very limited information. So if you look into the constituent field here, you can see there is this word unbekend and unknown is listed. So this is my newly learned Dutch word because I have been encountering it a lot. And when I search for this word in this very field constituent, so you can see the number of results it gives me, which is around 200,000. So I'm not claiming that all this constituent field is basically empty or unknown, but what it does mean is that we may not know how the acquisition has happened for the museum, or we simply do not know what this object is about. So for example, if we have a photograph, we don't know the context of the photograph, therefore we don't know what the photograph is for. So yes, we have such object around 200,000. And the traditional approach, or the approach that is commonly done from museum perspective, is to do prevalence research on these objects. And to do this prevalence, attain more information by doing prevalence research, it is difficult for the domain researchers because they have to focus one object at a time, or if they're lucky, then a small group at a time. So we simply need some external aid to help them to tackle this amount of objects that might be interesting for them to look at. And also there is possible that there is this institutional bias, because which object to choose and which object not to choose, this is always a choice made by the institutions. And also there is some part of interest that is played by the curator or the prevalence researcher themselves. So I started with an unfortunate case, but this is a more lucky one for us, where we do know the acquisition informations, but the problem even here exists that the museum data starts from the acquisition date and it goes forward, not the other way around. So here we are interested to give more light to the past. So yes, this is the emergence of my work package here. And here we are trying to ask a simple question, which is to what extent does existing object metadata in combinations with other related available data sources have potential to offer insightful knowledge for domain expert. So just, I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with the term metadata, so I'm just giving a brief intro. So this is the data that we get from the museum system, and then we have the linked data version. So we are lucky here that the National Museum of World Culture already made progress to make their data into a linked data format. So we have objects. So we have objects, and one object might be related to other objects, and the objects can be related to geolocations, and there are many more data, but I did not place all of them here just for the sake of simplicity. But I placed a very important term that we are specifically interested at, which is acquisition. So in the CDOC CRM model, acquisition is basically an event. And if we are lucky, then we also know the actor who is related to this particular event. So at this moment, when more and more heritage institutions are publishing their data in a linked data format, we are also have other resources that we might look for inspirations and aids, so which is our partner museums and the open source data like Wikidata or Wikipedia, and obviously the Delphi newspaper clippings, so which can help us in this context. So to answer these broader research questions, I would like to divide my research into 4 different chunks. So the first one, we would like to simply establish link between 2 data sets. So we have data on objects from the National Museum of World Culture, and we also have an important partner, which is Museum Brombeek, and Museum Brombeek holds informations on military personnel, so which is also a museum and at the same time a veterinary central for the retired military personnel. So we have around 15,000 biography or to somewhat biography into the system. So we are hoping to extract from this biography we are hoping to extract events from this biography, events such as war or any other related events, and we are hoping to connect people with these events and with the geolocation of that particular event. So the purpose of us to make convert these informations into such format is to link this actor to and enrich this information with with their biography information and try to understand which event they were placed on the moment when they did play a part in the acquisition of this object. So yes, that's the motivation, but the challenge over here is how do we disambiguate this entity? Because when we talk about actors, so we have the name of the actor, so which is a literal format. So in one database, it is listed in one format. In the other database, it is listed completely in a different format. So how do we understand which person is whom? So this is my research challenge here. And here we are going to here we are going into a case-based study. So this is, we have 4,242 objects, which are curated by the provenance researchers. So this is their 1 year of work. And this is the work by National Museum of World Culture, where they looked into the Indonesia collections and tried to find out which objects are connected to wars. So here they started with the collectors, and from that collector they tried to link each of these objects with Aceh war camp. So for that inspiration, they looked into the Sambucan, which is available into the National Archive. And based on their research, they concluded that these 4,242 objects are one way or another can be connected to the war camps based in Aceh back at that time. So what does it mean for us is to have a gold standard data, which are hand curated and of high quality. So the problem I mentioned is that in one database, we have informations like this. And on the other database, the name appears completely differently with some rank and also title. So here we would like to understand whether the state of the art entity disambiguation techniques are good enough to establish this link themselves, or do we need new method to make this automatically disambiguations? So what we are hoping to achieve, so we have these 4,242 objects, and from the same geographic locations and from the same time period, we also have other 10,000 objects. So we are hoping to establish automatic link by connecting them with their person, and from the person we are hoping to connect them with the events they were connected to. So in that way, we will have an enriched knowledge graph. So the purpose of us having this enriched knowledge graph is in terms to find patterns from the data. So these are some arbitrary object I placed in a linked data format. So these are two Dutch paintings painted by two different famous artists, but we can see a common pattern over there. So from this graph, we can say, okay, if it's a Dutch artist likes to paint with oil and canvas. So this is the pattern existed in the dataset. So we are hoping to find such pattern from our enriched knowledge graph. So what's the purpose of finding the pattern? One purpose of finding this pattern is making the knowledge explicit. So we believe there is a lot of knowledge within the institutions, so in an explicit or implicit format. So we are hoping to make it explicit. At the same time, we are also hoping to understand what are the categories are made of. So if we are saying some object as cultural objects, so what are the pattern exists in cultural objects? So what we actually mean by culture in the institutions. And in an ambition case is to find new informations which we can generate as a hypothesis for the domain researcher, which can be further approved or disapproved by their own research. And the third research challenge that I am interested to deal with is to make clusters based on the literal values on this object. So in the previous work, we will be using the metadata, and the metadata contains the tag of the tag that is given by the institution themselves. So if we have some object that has the tag culture, so that's the information we have. But so if we do our clustering based on those tags, we still have this risk of running into the bias that the institution plays itself. So how do we use the literal informations and try to find pattern from them? But so if it's an image and if we do our clustering based on this image, so what are the clusters we have, and how, so then the research challenge would be, how do we define these clusters? So yes, if it extracts some features, so how do we define those features that is understandable by the domain researchers themselves and also at the same time implementable? And last but not the least, the last challenge I am interested into making links. So I presented one happy case and one unhappy case where we knew the acquisition actor, where we did not knew the acquisition actor. So we have a lot of objects where we do not know the acquisition actor there. So from the pattern, can we understand, or can we at least project light which person can be related to some acquisition of some object? So it can be a good starting point for the domain researchers to look into it. So to summarize, I'm going back to my initial research questions, and now I'm rehashing the initial research questions, and now it becomes, to what extent does enriched knowledge graph with people, place, and event has the potential to generate hypotheses for domain expert? And by saying so, I am finishing my presentations, and thank you for your time and patience. If you have questions, then ask me now or Victor, and you can also contact us, and feel free to visit pressingmatter.com.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, Helene.
Yeah, a very practical question about the geolocation. I guess it could be where an object originates from, where it was acquisition or previous collections, where it is now. How do you kind of take into account those difference?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, from my understanding at this moment, I am not really specifically looking at like differentiate the geolocations, but I am aware, like when they are tagging some object with certain geolocation, it's a bit opaque. So we are not 100% certain if it's the location that they are from or if it's the location that we just know. So yes, this is a good question, that how do we deal with that? But at this moment, I'm not specifically looking into this case, but thanks for your remarks.
And are you then assuming that probably it's the original case?
Yeah, at this moment, I'm already assuming that it's from the original place. So yes, so maybe a good portion of the data does have the original place, but there are data which are not really representing their original place, or we just simply don't know. So these are the corner case that I wish to deal later, but yes, I'm going with easier problem at the beginning, then moving on to the difficult one later.
Yeah, this keeps popping up, right? We had a session of the Cultural AI Lab last week where we also immediately start to complicate something that's already super complicated. So let's not make it too hard for Sarah. Anna Kalis, you have a question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering whether you have thought of computer vision softwares as a tool to extract metadata from the images that you have, because that is something that it's happening to some extent within museums. But then one of the main problems that it's there is that these softwares have not been trained to analyze all images equally, clearly because they have been input, they received within their training process. Sorry, my cat is coming through the they have received more images from specific cultures and areas which might be more researched by that individual museum. So I was thinking this could probably be an interesting tool to add some information, but then the same problems that you've been having with bias and lack of data and lack of very clear, information might replicate also within that system. So I don't know, maybe the two things could dialogue actively or not.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. It's quite an interesting one. Certainly, we can make use of the computer vision tools to extract the features and to extract the metadata itself. But and in your questions, you already mentioned what the possible problems are. And yes, certainly, if we use certain tools, so the accuracy that we can expect to get would not be as high as we expect, because these are like, if we are considering objects from some remote locations, that is not very much popular to the algorithm yet. So yes, I am not certain what percentage of informations we can get from this tools, but at this moment I am not certain that we can use this, we can incorporate this computer vision tools into the systems. Rather than, we would like to go based on the metadata and follow the leads of the domain researchers, because these are something that is explainable both by us and also by them. So therefore, it has higher validity than going for some tool that is opaque in itself. So computer scientists cannot themselves explain these computer vision extraction features. So yes, it will also be hard for us to make them understand why exactly it extracted some features. So yes,
I guess probably the accuracy of your data set at the end of your process would be the ideal data set to feed within a software and maybe have it work more accurately than with its own tools.
Yeah, let's have this high hope.
Indeed. Again, a nice idea for further research.
Yeah.
Sorry, first Thunnis, then you please. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering about something you said, if I understood correctly. So you're finding clusters from the metadata. For instance, you had this example of the oil paintings. I was just wondering, do you take into account the collecting policy of the museums? Because if museums would only collect oil on canvas, then all Dutch painters would paint on canvas, right? So it's just wondering, how do you account for that?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think this is exactly what we are trying to do, to unleash what are the bias sort of collections have been placed in the institutions. So if we say that the Dutch painters only use oil and canvas, so is it also verified by the literature that we have? So if it's the claim, or if in some exhibition if we just use this oil and canvas painting, our visitors might end up thinking, okay, this is how Dutch painters do paint, but which is not the truth. So in my second work, I also aim to make those bias explicit, so that domain researchers do understand that this sort of bias does exist. Therefore, they should be concerned about certain issues.
Yes, thanks. But this might be a circular argument, because the literature is also might be based on the same biased, ideas. So it might be useful to actually look at the policies and the practices. I don't know how to, but it's.
Yeah, I think maybe if I can jump in, I think one of the nice things about the Pressing Matter project is that that this is a sort of iterative process, right? So anytime something comes out of the data, sort of a data-driven result, which can be a pattern, the interpretation of that pattern is done not by us, but really in sort of close collaboration with the province researchers and the museum people. So this is a work not about the Netherlands Museum for World Cultures, but with them. And I think so that's important, because for us it's also interpreting such rules or clusters is always difficult, and we need to take into account which collection policies or biases or historical events, they all play a role in which things end up in museums and which do not. So yes, all of this needs to be taken into account in some way. So there will be also I think a definite qualitative side to whatever comes out of the research.
Yeah, but yes, thanks, Victor, for jumping in. And I am happy to let you know that in this project context, we also have people that are working with policies of ownerships and how these objects are collected. So I'm sure my colleagues who have more expertise in policies will help us to understand what this why exactly we have this result, and analyze it further.
Yeah. Very nice.
Thanks. Thanks.
Nice approach. Really shows the value of these kind of collaborations, right? Multiple. Yeah. Final question.
So Victor just touched upon it. You mentioned domain experts a lot, and I was wondering how those ties work, like organizationally. How often do you see each other? Did you build the project together?
This is a very good question, and I'm very happy to answer it because we met each other like twice a month. So yes, we do this reading club, and where I myself dip my feet on the humanities domain, and I literally read the literature from the domain, which I often don't understand, and then they help me to understand them. And one of my supervisors, she is also from the humanities department, Susan Lejeune. So she is also supervising me to construct my questions and directing my research. And yes.
Yeah, so we've been doing these digital events project for a while, and I think one of the things that we've learned is that you really have to force people into a room and just sort of lock the door. They can only come out if they at least have some shared understanding of what it is. But this is really hard, right? I think we're finding out every time again that the cultural differences are very big, and the methodological questions. But I think that's where it gets interesting, right? What's boring to me, at least, is to do the science over a cultural data set. That's also fun, but we know how it works, and then we basically generate a little bit of knowledge in the computer science domain, and that's it. But I think the real gems are in this deeper collaboration, where you need to really, from the beginning, and you're right, from an organizational perspective, we have a shared space. I think COVID sort of the problem there, but this was a co-written proposal, right? With the humanities, but also philosophers, also artists involved. It's a very multidisciplinary project on the show and part of. But it's really sort of ingrained in the project itself. I think that's the only way that it works.
Yeah.
You didn't create like COVID bubbles.
No.
It's really next level.
Okay, yes, great example of, and also it really nicely shows the tension that if you want to scale up and use the power of linked data, that you also lose a lot, but you try to strike a balance. I think that's really great. So for the sake of time, we have to leave it here, but maybe there's some time at the end for further questions. So thank you very much, Sarah and Victor. And also cultural AI related projects on which Valentin Polman worked with is on the Social Bias Observatory, SABIO, which aims to develop is a research tool actually, which allows users to find biases, as you in the abstract explained it, on their own terms. So Valentin, I had a sneak preview last week, so I'm very happy that you're here to present it, because I think it was a very interesting process through this project. Is it share the screen? Oh yeah, we have to share. So just go back to
Like Victor, not a technical person. Thank you, Julia. Yeah, it's also good to be able to present this actually in person and demo it in person, because I think it needs that. I think it needs.
We can't see the full screen. You know how to do that portrait. Yeah, perfect.
Technology. Yes, so like Julia, thank you for the words. Like Julia said, I'm Valentin, Marieke, and I, my supervisor, and I are working on SABIO within the Cultural AI Lab. SABIO is short for the Social Bias Observatory, a project that we're also doing, like Sarah and Victor, together with the National Museum of World Cultures. Although we're only working on their collection. The hope is to extend this further. We also did develop this tool with the aim to generalize it a bit. Yeah, so let's get right into it. What I will do is I will now share the process a bit. This was not sort of a very structured process that I went through to define and to figure out what I actually want to be doing with this. Which is partly because that's not how I work, and it's partly also because I think that the field as a whole, the field that I will talk about now, is in what I would call a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. So I think it's also partly, people figuring out everywhere, what do we actually want? Where do we want this to go? People coming in from the outside and telling computer scientists what to do and what not to do. So I think right now, because this is such a high entropy field at the moment, we need to kind of let go of this idea that structured research is going to happen. That's why this is. And then for the second part of my presentation, I actually want to give you a live demo and hopefully make it a bit interactive. Right. So yeah, the logos of the Dutch Digital Heritage Network, because they funded it, and then the logo of the National Museum of World Cultures, we're working together with. First, for the context. So in terms of the National Museums of World Cultures, for my project, there are two things to mention. One is the Words Matter publication, which came out in 2018, but I think which also has been updated since then, or which is being updated constantly because it's supposed to be an unfinished guide. And this is where people from the Material Culture Research Group, they did this publication as a guide for terminologies around the museum, where they explain what terminologies perhaps to avoid, why they're problematic, where they come from, where the problematicness of it comes from. And it's also a thesaurus for that. So it just lists terms, explains the history, and then gives examples of how could do it better if you want to. That's the one thing. And then the collection itself, which I'm working on, this is the digital version of the collection. It's, if I go on the interface, it says that it has 800,000 objects, roughly a bit more. And then Sarah also mentioned this briefly. There's a lot of missing information all over the place, because my interface kind of needs objects to sort of have a full, sort of have most of the properties filled, which of course there could be bias in that. So that's actually something to be really aware of. But so in the first version of it, I actually toss out most of the collection. We need to have another talk with the Museum of World Cultures, because as it turns out, we can actually leave in more. But this is just also kind of like a core set of this sort of nice and clean data, just to get an idea of how this tool could work, and then we can scale it up to include more and more objects later on. But this also took me a lot of time. So like I spent a good few months on just this. And so the reason that these two pieces of information are on the slide is that the words matter, also like Sarah said, doing this, I mean, these are researchers doing this, and they're doing this one by one. So they're doing this term by term by term. And then of course they can use their own search interface to look for certain terms. But this is a very time-consuming process. And I just did the statistics yesterday. Just this subset of 140,000 objects has 7.3 million words in it. And just the titles and the descriptions. There's also the provenance information, curatorial notes, and some other things. And then these 7.3 million words lead to a vocabulary of 300,000 words. Of course, most of these are not interesting words, right? They're function words, but you can maybe see how trying to do the words matter on the whole collection is a bit of a hopeless task. That's where we come in. That's where they asked us. And so my background is in computational linguistics, and less in the structured data domain, but more in the unstructured data. So where I would just try to use unsupervised algorithms on text. And so then, of course, the first thing that I did when I started the project was put on that hat. And then, of course, if you want that, you have to have some kind of definition for bias, right? I think that everyone who's dealt with algorithms before and try to use algorithms to capture certain notions or concepts knows this, that definitions have to be even hyper precise, right? Because the computer doesn't actually, that's actually also what's nice about using computers to do things, right? Is that it forces us to be so precise. But here, well, it turns out to be a bit of an issue. But actually a very interesting one, and I think also one that can be very insightful if you think about it a lot, and if you're willing to engage with it. So the process that I went through was first using a definition like the one on the top left. This is from a very old and seminal paper that now doesn't get a lot of attention anymore, unfortunately. But so this is maybe one of the definitions that we could all intuitively come up with, or maybe also all intuitively agree on, because it's fairly general, a bit vague even. So one that says something about the systematicity, right? There has to be some kind of systematic aspect, and it has to be about unfairness, and it has to be about discrimination. And then the patients of these acts are either individuals or groups of individuals. But the problem here, right, is that it doesn't actually specify who could these groups be, who could these individuals be, what could be unfair discriminatory action, what does systematic mean. So while we can maybe agree that this definition is good, it's not enough yet to actually go on that for algorithmic work. So what we then did is we actually asked some of the people in the museum, curators, historians, social scientists that were sort of in our network to participate in a questionnaire where we actually asked them what kind of experiences with bias do you have? Do you research it? If so, and then this was that question. If so, what kind of working definitions do you actually use? So you know, is there some kind of more or less objective notion that you use if you find bias or if you look for bias. Maybe also to say this is not bias. Maybe this looks like bias, but I now decide that it isn't, based on my definition. And I realize this is a bit small to read, but the basic outcome of this was that the amount of working definitions that we got were as diverse as the people that we asked. So that's still not very useful because, again, I mean, okay, we're talking about polyvocality, so maybe there could be a way to actually incorporate all of these. You do also notice some patterns, right? So again, people talk about systematic, they again talk about discrimination, but again, not, I mean, also especially in a one-year project, not really feasible. And then that actually led me to give up on that. To just say, okay, let's not do this at all. And in hindsight, I'm really glad I did, because actually also last year there was a big sort of shift in paradigm there, where more people started to have this feeling of we shouldn't try to define bias in the way that we would usually for sort of treating it as a concept for AI algorithms, because the concept of bias is not such a concept that just has an easy definition that we can all agree upon. Because of lots of reasons, of course. And so found actually one of the papers that I really enjoyed reading, which surveyed almost 150 papers, and they basically also found the same thing, that people when they do bias detection in AI, they come up with ad hoc definitions. They don't cite philosophical research. They don't cite other AI research to get inspired by their definitions of bias. And that's the one side of it. And then the other side is that the motivation of that definition is often vague and inconsistent. So basically, they're all sort of falling into the same trap, if I may say that. And then this was a paper that was actually, Sarah brought that up very recently, that argued actually against, okay, not really against, but on being very careful about this as well. Because of course, if you want to have a definition of bias, you have to think about categories of people, right? You have to think about categorization. And this is, of course, it's very easy then to be reductionist. And then actually entrenching those same problematic structures in society that we're actually trying to combat here. So the whole picture of this, to me, kind of clearly said, don't try to do this, and actually leave the definition of the bias to the person who uses the tool. So while the original idea was bias identification or bias detection, I then actually said, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to refrain from it. Another reason is actually also that if we just assume for a second that we could, I might not even want to, because dealing with the biases in the museums also has a performative side to it, right? It's also about the people who engage with this having discussions about it among themselves. And it's not the kind of problem maybe where, like, a self-driving car, the driving itself is just getting from A to B, right? It's nice if someone can do that for you because you just want to be at B at some point. There's not necessarily something inherently interesting about getting there. If you enjoy driving sport cars, maybe, but in this case, that is definitely the case, and maybe even that's the whole point. It's not just about being able to point out where bias is, but actually about having the discussion around it. Why is it bias? What does that bias lead to? And these kinds of questions, and then having an open discussion about them. So where does that leave us? That's actually interesting because the name Sabio, Social Bias Observatory, was put on the project even before all of this. But in the end, it turns out that observatory was the perfect name for it, because that's then what we decided to do is actually to take that word very literally and to say, okay, we're not an identification tool. This is why I put a picture of a telescope. This is actually a telescope in Indonesia, apparently. This picture is in the Museum of World Culture's collection. the tool that we're building is more supposed to be a telescope, rather than, I don't know what the metaphor for the other thing would be, but I think you get the picture. And the idea with the telescope is that there still has to be an astrophysicist doing the actual job of identifying where stars are, what the constellations are. Is this actually a black hole that I'm looking at or not? All these things, because of course the astrophysicist has some knowledge that the telescope cannot have. And similarly, the person building the telescope doesn't necessarily have to have that knowledge. The person building the telescope has to have knowledge about lenses, about engineering, about probably some kind of spectral filtering on light, all of these things that the astrophysicist doesn't necessarily need to have. So in that sense, there's some kind of tasking also going on where they also kind of stay off of each other's turf, but together we find stars. Maybe I think that. I quite like this metaphor at this point because it drives home the point. And then there was another paper that Anna pointed out. All these papers kind of came to me in hindsight, and then I kind of realized, oh yeah, this is actually what I think I'm doing as well. This is a nice paper from computational anthropology, where what they're trying to show, also in some experimental way, what they try to show, and I think also managed to show, is that AIs, when they deal with such cultural concepts and social concepts, what we shouldn't be using them for necessarily so much is to try to imitate us. So we don't necessarily want to try to imitate the historian or the curator looking for bias, but we want to help them in pointing out and highlighting those interesting examples that they want to be looking at. So in that sense, we're just sort of maybe speeding up their work a bit, but they're still doing the work essentially. We're not doing the work for them. So that was actually also nice to see, right? That other people can maybe argue for this in a more structured way than I ever could. So this is the observatory. This is just the other materials, and then now, of course, you're all waiting to actually see the tool. Go back to it. So this is Savio. First, a disclaimer. I did not build this interface. That credit goes to Werner, who I think is also in the audience on Zoom, who did a really nice job. But so I only did the backend. So if you're interested in a nice front end for these kind of things, I think Werner would be happy to hear from you. So first, some explanation. What we then actually try to do a bit, and this is here on the left hand side, we actually try to re-implement to some degree the search interface that the Museum of World Cultures already has, because that we thought might also make it a bit more intuitive, because this is actually the kind of interface that people use when they research bias in the collection, right? So you basically have the same kind of ways of searching. You can enter keywords; those will then search in the titles and the descriptions. Of course, objects of dates, or you can then use dates. Classification is a property that actually comes from the Museum of World Cultures. This is nice because we actually built this to be general, so that if you have a different collection with different attributes, they would also be different here. But these are not hard-coded; these are actually dynamic, which is kind of nice. So this is a work in progress, so sometimes it's also a bit broken, I have to say. There should be something. Right, so this is sort of the original part of the interface, and what we now, of course, what's new is that so before, if you enter something and you search for something in the collection, what you get is this sort of, I'm sure you've seen this before, sort of this tiled view of tiles of objects. So object 1, object 2, object 3. You can also sort them based on certain properties. You can have like some kind of relevance. I'm not sure how that is computed here. But inherently, the sorting doesn't actually mean much about, I mean, okay, if sorting might be rather meaningless in most cases, or for most users, or for especially for if you want to research bias, right? The actual object that you're most interested in if say you search for objects in the context of Suriname, let's say, the objects with a lot of bias that you're actually interested in might be at page 100. And so you'd have to click through it, or you'd have to specify your search a lot there to actually get to these objects. And so this is exactly what we're trying to do here. We're trying to float these objects somehow to the top so that people can more readily see those and maybe not have to look so much at objects that aren't actually relevant for bias because of a multitude of reasons that I will go into now. So the way we did this then is in a scatter plot. I mean, these points is what we call a scatter plot in data science. And so each point is an object. And if you hover over it, you get this little card. And if you click on it, you get the full thing. You can also click on it and then get back into the original public collection interface. Right, so we have a title and a description, a date. I think this is the object ID. So this is what's going on here, right? On the x-axis, in this case, we have the begin date. So the date. We also have a second date, which is the end date, which is something that is very specific about the way that the Museum of World Cultures solved a certain issue. But we can also sort by department. Again, this is dynamic, so if a different museum has different properties on their objects, the sorting could be different. And then we also have classifications. So for instance, here, this is Insular Southeast Asia. These are, oh no, sorry, that would be department then. So for instance, this is China region, just a name for a department that the National Museum of World Cultures has. So we didn't come up with these. Does that make sense? That kind of clear how this plot works? That the points are objects and that the x-axis sort of is different ways of sorting in some way, right? To me, at least, it's simple enough. And then the y-axis, that's of course where the magic happens. I mean, that's where we come in. That's where our extra work happens. And for that, we have different algorithms. So one of the things that's based on what I just told you before, there is no single algorithm that sort of has the correct sorting for all different cases, right? Because bias is such a diverse thing, comes in all sorts of aspects of data, right? Comes because a certain term was mentioned, comes because something was missing, comes because something wasn't mentioned. This is why I think we actually need lots of different algorithms that have different uses for different aspects of bias. So this is the reason why we then decided to actually give a list of algorithms. So there's not just the single one that does everything, but rather small ones, and then they can actually be very small. So for instance, the one that we're looking at right now just actually literally just counts the number of words here in the title and in the description. Literally what it does. There's just nothing else going on. Now, I guess you might wonder, how does that relate to bias, right? But and I mean, one of the points of what I just said is I can't really tell you. You have to be a curator in a museum to know why. But just as an example, for instance, objects from Europe, from the department Europe, might have longer descriptions, right? So that's where you might start to see some bias in there. So I have 4 implemented right now. I hope this will be much more at the end. Let's actually search for something.
And what happens when you click the info button? Is that info on the algorithm?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But this one has the right.
Or just link to a paper, you know, that's also.
Yeah, but how do you link to the paper that just counts number of words? But yeah, sure.
I'm working on it.
Different ways are possible. Yeah, but so that's also the idea, right? So that the info button, you can learn more about how this algorithm behaves and what it does.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is that because these are all such simple algorithms, I can tell you what it literally does, but then what it means, what it does, that's something that you
No,
have to
that
find
goes,
out, right?
yeah, of course, but that's what you said. It's a sort of tool that represents the metadata or some dimensions of the metadata that heuristically invites you to develop questions or hypotheses.
Yes.
So it's a hypothesis generation
Also, yeah.
tool.
Yeah, and I guess also just just advise you to search the collection in sort of new ways that you might not do otherwise. I mean, I've no experience really with researching collections, but I can sort of see this myself also happening, that it kind of, you just click on some other parameters, maybe you're not even sure what you're doing, and then you just get a different view, and then you click on an object, and that's maybe an object that you would have never actually hoped to see anyway. But of course, might be a bit useless sometimes, right? It might also be a waste of time, but yes, that was a question.
Well, you said you haven't written it yet, but wouldn't it be useful that you write a short description of what it does, but then you go see your colleagues who are using the tool and ask them to write, and in the same way you get in bookstores, like recommendations like, Sarah really enjoyed this book. You could have the specific employee write how they use it.
That's a really good idea, yeah. I appreciate that, thanks. Yeah. We had a similar idea also about this, because similar to also what you said, what the people in the Museum of World Cultures also said to us was that there's a lot of ways in which when they search for bias, when they research into bias, it's not sort of a direct thing. Someone finds something, finds that interesting, goes to a colleague, discusses that with them, goes back, finds something else, and then sort of it sparks off a whole discussion. So they also said to us is what they would also appreciate, and hopefully that's something maybe for version 2. Is that also people could leave notes on these objects, right? Could leave traces basically behind them where they went, so that their colleagues could find those traces, and then maybe you happen to go then in that direction, but there was another direction over here, so then maybe you want to go that way.
Well, there's a nice linked data exploration tool where you can make narrative paths in the media suite. Clarion Media Suite said you may want to look at.
It's also built by Werner.
Yes, I know. I already told him I recognize the design. This button appears in the media suite.
We're also talking to Salon to see if
this could be great.
I could go on talking about this. I don't know if you have.
Are there any questions at home or here?
So is this work already being used by the National Museum?
No. So I'm literally just finished sort of building a stable version.
Okay. Yeah.
We have a workshop planned for the 12th of May. You're also all in welcome to join. I think we want to focus it a bit more on people that actually work at the museum, but perspectives are also welcome. So of course now we're really excited to share this. So they, like also Victor and Sarah said, it's also good to, or it's even important to not just get the assignments, lock yourself in, and then come back and say this is what we did. So of course we've been in touch with them, but not actually so much more recently with people who actually do this kind of research. So we were in touch with the former head of the collection, for instance, who of course knows how the people that she works with go about this, but she doesn't necessarily do it herself on a daily basis.
But she might have examples of objects that she knows
Exactly.
have been described in a very biased way, and she can look them up and see if they turn up. I don't know if it's not a very systematic way of looking at what you've done and how useful it is, but it might help.
No, but I very much agree also with this. I think, I don't know, for me, systematicity here is not even really maybe the right thing. We also got the feedback in the beginning from someone who, and that really struck a chord with me, that really stayed in my head for a while, who said that beyond anything, such a tool has to be disruptive. Because the people who look for bias, they already know how to do that. And of course, we want to automate it to make it faster, but the real potential of such a tool could actually be to keep them out of the entrenched paths that they're always on, because she's actually someone who does this kind of research, and she says, she and her colleagues, yeah, they when they go to a new collection or they want to do a new exhibition, they always go for the same terms. They always go for the same kinds of biases that they already know to exist. They know where to find them. They also maybe know that they're easy to find in these kinds of collections. So I think once you go disruptive, then you leave systematic behind, right? Because to me, these are almost opposing factors to each other. But yeah, I think it's then actually also nice to make a point out of that, right? And I mean, also just because you mentioned it, I think it would also be really nice if this tool could maybe in later projects get into a feedback loop, either with itself or with other projects, right? Where people could use this maybe as sort of first exploration tool, and then put out these objects, and then you could start maybe in something like Sarah's project, then you could start seeing patterns and what people output, right? And then use that as input for maybe then actually doing some AI machine learning training, or informing other algorithms on what they should do.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Any other questions for Valentin online?
Question by Thomas. Please, maybe if you stop sharing your screen, we can see it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valentin, for that very interesting presentation, and also for the tool. It looks great. It also reminds me a little bit of stuff like Gephi, right, where you could also implement multiple algorithms yourself. So congratulations on that. What I was wondering about, and I appreciated your discussion of these different notions of bias, but what I was wondering about is that there's, of course, a very technical definition of bias used in computer science, in machine learning. So in the tools you also apply, and that is when the data which a model is trained is, of course, not aligned with the task the model is intended to perform, right? So that's a very clear-cut technical definition of bias. And I wonder how you would engage with that, because I think like you mentioned some very interesting work, but that conceptualizes bias as also something in a sense a little bit vague and as a container concept, maybe even. So how would you say that you engage? Sorry, I'm repeating myself. So how do you engage with that concept? Thanks.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. And I know exactly what you're talking about, because also you start your research into literature, and then it's most of it is actually this kind of literature that uses conceptualizations that you just mentioned. Because the time frame of my project was a bit limited, I actually tried to distance myself as much as I could from these kinds of concepts. One of the points that I find interesting or even important about this is that this data-inspired, data-oriented conceptualization that you mentioned, so where bias is maybe about certain categories are not represented in your data as they should have been, or as you would have wanted, or there's an imbalance in representation. One problem that I find with that is that too data-oriented means that we're losing the social dimension a little bit. I had this discussion also recently with Melanie, for instance, that if we find social biases in data, that's just evidence for something that's happening in society, right? So I think we always want to keep that dimension. And I think if we focus too much on just what's going on in the data, then we're pretending that, or maybe we get very quickly into this idea that the way that the data is the problem. But the way that the data is just a symptom of what's going on in the larger society.
But maybe just to cut in, because you are using these models, which are also they work because they are aligned with the data on which you are trained. So it sort of feels like a sort of a runaround in that sense, because of course I agree with you that we should take all these societal concepts into account, but then you specifically have a project that applies these models to find bias. So if you then, it's sort of, to me it feels a little bit strange that you then not engage with the fact that these models work because they have a very clear conception of what data bias is.
Right. I think, sorry, then I think we actually have a bit of a misunderstanding, because I'm not using those models. That's the engines, we call them engines, the algorithms that are currently implemented in the interface. None of them are trained to identify bias. As I said, the one that I showed as an example just counts the number of words in an object. So that's not, there's not even any training going on. That's just a deterministic algorithm. The only one that I currently have that uses machine learning gives you the probability of an object within the collection based on n-gram probabilities. It's a bit of a technical thing. But again, like this algorithm has no notion of what bias is. It's just that I have the intuitive idea that the probability of an object, so it's the typicalness, if you will, in a statistical sense, that would correlate with what researchers might find to be biased. So that is more like a perspective that could be useful to identify biases. Does that make sense? So that's I agree with your point that would be circular, that would not be the right way to go. That's exactly why I didn't go there.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Thomas is happy with your answer.
Good. Okay.
Okay, also looking at the time, I think then I wholeheartedly thank you, Valentin, for sharing this interesting result. Thank you all also, both at home or wherever you are, and those present here on site. Our next event coincides with your workshop, I'm afraid, or at least it's also on the 12th of May. We have a symposium then, because we always have the second Thursday of the month. We then have a symposium on uncertainty in historical data with Tara Andrews and Michael Piotrowski. Again, from 3 to 5, I think it's here. No? Yeah, in this room, again, hybrid will be recorded. So we'll have to catch up with both our events in some way or another. So thank you especially to the presenters, also Thunnis again. And it was a great pleasure to have you all, and hope to see you in May or at any other event we're organizing. And for those here, you're very welcome again to join us for drinks at Seppel's around the corner. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.